They didn't call her brave, or wife, or even victim. Just that woman with the phone. That's what the officer wrote in the report. No name, no dignity. Just a vague label for someone who had the audacity to press record. I read those words 3 days after the incident, while Tanya lay quiet in the hospital bed, a faint burn mark still blooming across her collarbone where the taser barbs had struck her. A young nurse walked in, didn't greet me, didn't meet my eyes, just scanned her chart, muttered civilians should know when to stop filming, and pulled the privacy curtain closed like we were inconveniencing her day. I didn't respond, didn't correct her, didn't remind her that Tanya had once been a base photographer who had filmed inside blast zones and field hospitals, that her footage had once helped find 2 missing medics. I just sat there in my old service coat, staring at the folded piece of paper I had slipped into my breast pocket the night before. A memo from the police chief, handwritten, apologizing for what happened. But the part that gutted me the most wasn't the apology. It was the line scrawled at the bottom, "You warned us." I didn't listen. That's when I knew. Knew this wasn't about paperwork or policy. It was about how people see someone once the uniform's off. And if you believe freedom doesn't expire just because your hair's gone gray, if you believe filming in public shouldn't mean getting dragged to the ground while your husband watches helplessly, then like and subscribe. Because stories like this one, they're not just about justice. They're about memory. It started like any other weekend. Soft breeze, birdsong, a farmer's market bustling with good intentions and wicker baskets. Tanya and I arrived just after 9 a.m., like clockwork. I wore my usual faded army cap, the one with the bent brim and the old 75th crest on the back. Tanya carried her canvas tote and her phone, ready to catch moments for her little community video series. She filmed the couple selling sunflowers, the kid juggling apples, the elderly man who played banjo by the kettle corn stand. Nothing political, nothing dramatic. Just real life. I remember the smell of cinnamon bread, the hum of laughter, and how Tanya looked at me mid-shot and smiled that smile that always meant, "See? They're still good here." And then the shouting started. A rookie cop, Salters, I'd later learn, was berating a teenage vendor over some expired permit. Loud, red-faced, chest puffed like a man trying to be something he wasn't. Tanya instinctively lifted her phone, not intruding, not interfering, just documenting. We weren't 20 feet away, standing behind a flower cart. Salters spotted her. He marched over, demanded she stop filming. Tanya said, calmly, "I'm within my rights, sir. This is a public event." He snatched at her phone. She stepped back, startled, and that's when everything went sideways. He shouted that she was obstructing an officer. People turned. A few phones came up. I stepped in between them, hands raised, not aggressive, just protective. "She's my wife," I said. "She's not doing anything wrong." His hand went to his belt. I didn't think he'd use it. I've faced rifles, mortars, incoming fire. I've seen real combat. But I wasn't prepared for the sound of that crackling pop. And I'll never forget the way Tanya's body seized and collapsed like a puppet's strings were cut. I dropped to my knees, screamed her name, cradled her head as her eyes fluttered, unfocused. People were screaming now, one woman crying. She didn't do anything. Someone live-streamed it. Another yelled, "She's a veteran's wife, you lunatic." But Salters didn't care. He stood over me, panting, like he'd won something. I didn't swing. I didn't threaten. I just looked at him and said, "You don't even know who she is. Who we are." He scoffed and turned away. But someone else didn't. Someone had called the chief. Because 7 minutes later, a black sedan peeled into the lot, tires hissing. Out stepped Chief Nadine Harper, retired Army herself, Bronze Star, no nonsense. She didn't need a briefing. She didn't ask for excuses. She saw Tanya on the ground, saw the taser prongs still coiled in her blouse, saw the crowd, then saw me, crouched beside my wife, shaking with a rage I had learned long ago to bury deep. And she froze. "Lucas," she whispered. I looked up. "You're late," I told her. She didn't blink, just turned to Salters and, in front of everyone, told him to hand over his badge and sidearm. No yelling, no theater, just 4 words that dropped like a hammer. "You are relieved." Immediately, he stuttered, mumbled something about protocol. She didn't care. "You just tossed a retired combat medic's wife for exercising her rights," she said, voice flat. "Do you know how many men this man carried off the field while bleeding from his own chest?" He didn't answer. The crowd was silent. Tanya stirred beneath me, groaning. I whispered to her, "It's okay. They see us now." But truthfully, they should have seen us before. Because this story isn't about a taser. It's about what happens when people stop recognizing the quiet weight of a life spent serving others. It's about the moment a phone becomes more dangerous than a gun, and compassion gets overridden by power. It's about how Tanya once filmed drone footage of medical drops in hostile zones, and now can't hold her phone without flinching. And it's about how, even with all the medals, citations, and folded flags we keep tucked in drawers and memory boxes, we're still just those people when uniforms aren't visible. But I'll tell you this, that farmer's market never forgot what happened. And neither will I. Because when they write about Tanya, she won't be that woman with the phone. She'll be the woman who stood still so others could see what fear looks like when it wears a badge and calls it law. You can tell the difference between a crowd and a reckoning by the way silence behaves. A crowd gasps, murmurs, paces, but a reckoning stands still. That's what I saw the second Chief Harper told that officer to hand over his badge. People didn't cheer, didn't clap. They just stood there, like they knew something sacred had cracked open in front of them. Tanya was half-sitting now, her breathing shaky but stable, her fingers still twitching slightly from the volts. I wrapped my jacket around her shoulders, and she kept her hand locked on my wrist, like she wasn't quite ready to trust the ground beneath her yet. "You okay?" I whispered. "You caught me," she murmured, smiling through a wince. Meanwhile, Chief Harper had stepped forward, blocking the sun with her uniform cap as she faced Officer Salters, who had finally gone pale. "Do you have any idea who you just assaulted?" she asked him, but it wasn't really a question. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need volume. She had history. "That woman you tossed documented frontline operations in northern Afghanistan and trained with the 112th Combat Camera Unit," she said. "Her husband patched up half of FB Moxon after it was shelled. And you," she glanced down at his trembling hands, "you didn't even ask a name before you pulled the trigger." Salters stammered something about disobedience, protocol, body cams. Harper didn't blink. "Your body cam wasn't even turned on," she said. "But don't worry. There are 17 others that were." That's when someone in the crowd raised a phone and muttered, "Make that 18. He lowered it respectfully, like a witness, not just to a crime, but to a correction. Two paramedics knelt beside Tanya, and I reluctantly stepped aside to let them do their work. Harper knelt next to me, her hand firm on my shoulder. "I should have been here sooner," she said. I looked her in the eye. "You weren't late. You were exactly 7 minutes too late." She nodded. No excuses. Just that hard, silent nod that veterans exchange when there's no need to explain the weight between two people who've worn a flag on their shoulder for more years than they have it. Tanya was helped to her feet. Someone handed her back her phone. It was still recording, still warm in her palm. She looked at me, like she wanted permission to cry, but all I gave her was a smile. Not the big kind, just a breath of one, enough to say, "We're still here." The crowd began to shift. Chief Harper asked us to follow her to the station. Not in handcuffs, not with sirens, just a quiet request for a statement. And maybe, I figured, something deeper, an acknowledgement. On the ride over, Tanya leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Did they really not recognize me?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer would have hurt more than the truth already had. At the station, everything stopped when we walked in. Desks quieted. A printer jammed. Even the officers who had nothing to do with it suddenly found reasons to go silent. A rookie at the front desk stood up, gave a clumsy salute, and stammered, "Sergeant Callahan, ma'am." Tanya blinked. I'd never seen her so surprised. "That's you," I whispered. "They finally saw you." We sat in the chief's office. Her walls were lined with dusty books and a single black and white photo of her first deployment. She handed us water and sat across from us like a peer, not a boss. "You don't have to press charges," she began. "But I'm asking you to." I looked at Tanya. She looked at me. "Why?" I asked. "Because this town needs to remember who built it," she said. "And because too many people wear the badge without understanding the oath." Tanya didn't hesitate. "I'll testify," she said, her voice sharper now. "I'll speak at the council hearing. I'll show every frame of what he did. And I'll do it wearing my service jacket." Harper smiled, and for the first time, it was soft. "Then let me show you something," she said, opening a drawer and pulling out a file. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy. "This is from a complaint filed last month. Same officer. Different woman. No video. No witness. It was buried." Tanya's mouth tightened. Not anymore, she said. The rest of the day passed like a wound being stitched, slow, careful, quiet. We filled out forms. We gave statements. But the strange part wasn't what we said. It was how the officers looked at us after. Like they'd forgotten we were in this town. Like they were seeing ghosts they were supposed to salute. A few offered apologies, not the fake kind, but the quiet, the shame kind that comes from people who suddenly realize they've been sleepwalking next to giants. By evening, word had spread. The mayor called Tanya personally. The footage hit national news by nightfall. And somewhere between all that noise, I sat at home in my flannel and stared at the folded flag on our mantel, wondering how many more times we'd have to prove we belonged here. But then Tanya came over, leaned her head against my arm, and whispered, "They didn't forget us. They just forgot to look." I kissed the top of her head and said, "Well, they're looking now." And from that day forward, every Saturday at that market, I stood beside her camera, and not to protect her, but to remind them all, this isn't just a woman with a phone. This is someone who served. Someone who documents truth the way I used to dress wounds. And if they think a taser's going to stop that, they haven't learned a thing about what makes a stand. They say justice is a process, but sometimes it shows up in a pressed uniform and combat boots that haven't lost their shine. 2 weeks after Tanya gave her testimony, we were invited back to City Hall, not for trial, not for press, but for something they called a review of protocol. Though I could tell from the careful way they arranged the chairs that this wasn't going to be just policy talk. Tanya wore her old unit badge stitched on a blazer. I wore the same service cap I hadn't touched in years. When we stepped inside, every officer in uniform stood not from order, but reflex. That's how we knew the tide had shifted. Respect doesn't arrive with sound. It shows up in posture, in stillness, in silence that listens. Chief Harper met us at the door and led us to the front row. "Just stay seated," she whispered. "You've already stood long enough for this country." The mayor opened with a statement. Something about values. About trust. But it was what came after that mattered. The footage played on a projection screen, with no music, no edits, just that one moment frozen in time, Tanya calmly filming, then suddenly folded over, electricity rippling through her body. The room didn't breathe, and when the lights came back on, they didn't speak either. Because how do you defend a uniform that turned against its own oath? Tanya stood. She didn't wait for a microphone. Her voice didn't shake. I wasn't a threat. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't breaking the law. I was bearing witness. That's all. She turned slightly, not for drama, but to look every officer in the eye. Some of you wear cameras every day. I wore one in combat zones. I didn't flinch when rounds cracked overhead. But I flinched when a badge here saw me as an enemy for recording what I saw. One officer whispered, "Ma'am," but she raised her hand gently. "I'm not angry. I'm awake. And I hope you're too." And with that, she stepped back into her seat beside me, and the applause didn't come from the audience. It came from the back of the room, where 3 recruits, barely old enough to remember what Iraq meant, clapped first, then stood, then saluted. I didn't cry. Not then. But my jaw clenched in that way it used to when I held tourniquets in my hands and whispered to bleeding soldiers, "You're going to be okay." Because in that moment, I realized we were. The council passed what they later called the Callahan Policy, mandatory de-escalation training, new bystander recording protections, and annual civilian veteran forums. I called it what it really was, an overdue apology in the form of a law. But the real ending didn't come in chambers or handshakes. It came 3 days later, when we returned to the market, not dressed up, not armored, just 2 people carrying groceries and a camera back. We expected stares. What we got was gratitude. The teenager who'd been yelled at by Salters ran over and handed Tanya a bouquet of sunflowers. "You filmed truth," he said. "That means something." The kettle corn vendor handed us a free bag with Callahan's "Eat Free" scribbled in Sharpie. And then someone started clapping, one by one. Not a cheer. Not a chant. Just slow, real applause. Not for Tanya being tossed. Not for me being her husband. But for what that moment made people see. Because sometimes, it takes pain to wake up a town. It takes a jolt to the spine for a city to remember its heart. And in this case, the heart looked like a woman with a camera and a man who never stopped guarding her flank. Later that night, I found Tanya out on the porch, watching the replay again, not for fame, but for frame-by-frame understanding. She paused it at the exact moment the taser hit, where her face goes slack and the camera falls sideways. "This frame," she said, pointing. "This is where they forgot who I was." I nodded. "And everything after it?" "That's where we reminded them." We sat there until the sun dipped low. I never asked her to stop filming. Not once. Because if there's one thing service taught me, it's that memory doesn't preserve itself. It has to be captured, documented, carried forward. And she did that, just not with a gun, not with rank. With her eyes. Her steadiness. Her refusal to stop recording. A week later, Officer Salters resigned. No fanfare. No press. Just a letter that said, "I watched the footage. I understand now." Tanya didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just whispered, "Good." And that was it. Not victory. Not vengeance. Just closure. And you know what? That's enough. So if you're still listening, if you're still here, let me leave you with this. The next time you see someone filming, don't ask what they're trying to prove. Ask what they're trying to preserve. Because one day, that footage might be the only thing that stops a lie from taking root. Tanya didn't flinch for a headline. She didn't fall for fame. She filmed because she believed in remembering, even when remembering hurts. And me? I stood beside her, like I always have, on battlefields, in hospitals, and now, at farmers' markets where peace shouldn't come with a taser warning. You don't need to wear a flag on your shoulder to defend freedom. Sometimes, all it takes is pressing record,